The moment you land on Mars, you are already stranded. You just don't know it yet, and the reason has nothing to do with the rocket, the fuel, or the distance back. It has everything to do with what the journey has already done to your body by the time you get there. When you land on Mars, are you already too far gone to ever make it back? If this kind of content makes you stop scrolling and actually think, make sure to give this video a like. Now let's get started. Let's start with something almost nobody considers when they picture a Mars mission. Your body evolved on Earth. Every single system inside you, your heart, your spine, your blood, your immune system, your sense of balance, even the fluid surrounding your brain, was shaped by roughly 4 billion years of evolution for one specific condition, 1 g of gravitational force. The exact pull you feel right now, in whatever chair or bed or floor you happen to be on, that 1 g is not a background detail. It is the environment your biology was built inside of, like a fish built for water. The moment you remove it, the moment you enter microgravity, your body does not simply float. It begins to change, and not in small, manageable, reversible ways. Within the first few days of weightlessness, your cardiovascular system begins restructuring itself. On Earth, your heart works constantly to push blood upward against gravity, up to your brain, up to your shoulders, up through every vessel above your waist. In microgravity, that effort essentially disappears. Blood redistributes toward your upper body and your head. Your heart, interpreting this sudden shift as a signal that there is too much fluid in the system, responds the way any muscle responds when it stops being used. It shrinks. NASA's long-duration spaceflight studies have found that astronauts can lose up to around 20 to 25% of their cardiac muscle mass during extended missions. The heart, the organ you quite literally cannot live without, becomes smaller, weaker, and less efficient. Now here is why that matters so specifically for a return trip from Mars. A one-way journey to Mars takes somewhere between 6 and 9 months, depending on where Earth and Mars are in their orbits around the Sun. You spend that entire duration in microgravity. Then you land on Mars, which has about 38% of Earth's gravitational pull. Your body begins adjusting to that new environment. Partial adjustment. Your heart starts working again, but at a fraction of what it would face on Earth. Then, when the return window opens, and we will talk about those windows in a moment, because they are their own nightmare, you climb back into a spacecraft and spend another 6 to 9 months in microgravity. By the time you are descending back toward Earth's atmosphere, your cardiovascular system has spent well over a year in low or zero gravity, and now it has to handle 1 full G again. Not 38%, not 0, 100%, the full weight of Earth's pull. For a heart that has shrunk and weakened over that timeline, that re-entry is not a homecoming. It is a stress test the body may not be prepared for. In 2021, a study published in the journal Circulation tracked NASA astronaut Scott Kelly after his famous 348 days aboard the International Space Station. Even after months of intensive post-mission rehabilitation, his cardiac function showed measurable decline, and Scott Kelly's mission, historic as it was still less than a full year. A complete Mars return mission, accounting for time in transit both ways and time spent on the surface, could mean well over 2 years of cumulative exposure to low or zero gravity environments. The heart is not the only thing that starts failing. Your bones are dissolving. That sounds dramatic, but it is accurate. In microgravity, your skeletal system begins a process called disuse osteoporosis. Because your bones no longer need to bear your weight, they begin shedding calcium at a rate that would be considered medically alarming here on Earth. Researchers have measured bone density losses of roughly 1 to 2% per month in microgravity, which might sound manageable until you consider that a person with severe osteoporosis on the ground typically loses about 1 to 2% of bone density per year. Astronauts can experience in a single month what the average person loses over 12. And here is what makes this particularly stubborn. Exercise helps, but it does not fully solve it. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station exercise up to 2 hours every single day, resistance training, cycling, treadmill work, specifically to fight bone and muscle loss. Even with that level of discipline, the degradation continues. Some studies suggest it may be physiologically impossible to fully halt bone loss through exercise alone in true microgravity. So by the time a Mars astronaut boards their return vehicle and eventually begins descending toward Earth, their skeleton could be dangerously compromised. We already know that astronauts returning from standard 6-month ISS missions frequently cannot walk unassisted for days or even weeks after landing. They have to be physically carried out of the capsule. Their legs simply do not have the strength or structural integrity to support them in full Earth gravity right away. Now multiply that. A Mars return mission could involve double or more the duration of even the longest ISS missions. The skeletal fragility could reach a level where the physical act of landing, of re-entry forces, of simply trying to stand up, becomes medically dangerous. But bone loss, as serious and as real as it is not the most disturbing thing that prolonged spaceflight does to the human body. This next one genuinely unsettles researchers, and it should unsettle you too. There is a condition called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. Scientists and physicians refer to it as SANS, and what it describes is something that sounds almost impossible until you understand the physics behind it. In microgravity, the cerebrospinal fluid that normally cushions your brain and spinal cord does not drain and distribute the way it does on Earth. Gravity plays a critical role in managing that fluid on the ground. It pulls it downward, keeping the pressure in your skull within a healthy range. Remove gravity, and that fluid begins to pool. Pressure builds inside the skull, and that pressure pushes, quite literally, against the back of your eye. Over time, the optic nerve swells. The eyeball itself can change shape. The retina can flatten, and vision degrades in ways that are not always reversible. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2017 examined 15 astronauts who had spent extended periods aboard the International Space Station. The researchers found structural changes to the eyes and brain in the majority of them. MRI scans revealed that the brain had physically shifted inside the skull, moving upward toward the top of the head. The ventricles, the fluid-filled spaces inside the brain, had changed in size and shape. These were not minor variations. These were measurable, documentable physical changes to the human brain after months in space. Now apply that to a Mars return mission. Not 6 months of cumulative spaceflight exposure, but potentially 18 months, 24 months, more, depending on the timeline. The cerebrospinal fluid pressure has been elevated the entire time. The optic nerve has been under stress the entire time. By the time the spacecraft is making its final approach to Earth, what is the state of that astronaut's vision, their cognitive function, their ability to process information, to make decisions, to operate complex systems under pressure? These are not hypothetical questions. They are active areas of research, and the honest answer from the scientific community right now is, we do not fully know. And that uncertainty leads directly to one of the most uncomfortable scenarios in all of human spaceflight planning. If an astronaut's vision has significantly degraded during the return journey, if their cognitive sharpness has been dulled by months of neurological pressure, if their physical strength is compromised and their reaction time is slower than it was at launch, who is actually flying the spacecraft home? Everything we have been talking about happens because of how deeply connected human biology is to this planet, to its gravity, to the conditions that shaped us over billions of years. And it makes you wonder, what would it feel like to actually see the objects we are talking about? Not in an animation, not in a rendered image, but with your own eyes on a clear night through a real lens pointed at the real sky. I have been using the Celestron StarSense Explorer for a while now, and I want to mention it here because it genuinely changed the way I experience these topics. It uses your smartphone to map the sky in real time and guides you to exactly what you want to see: planets, nebulae, the kinds of objects that come up in videos like this one. You do not need any experience. The technology does that part. What you bring is the curiosity. If that sounds like something you want, the link is in the description and pinned on the comments. Radiation. The word gets used a lot in conversations about spaceflight, and it tends to get filed away as a background concern. Something engineers manage with shielding, something astronauts accept as a professional risk, something that sounds serious but remains abstract. It is not abstract, and for a Mars return mission, it is arguably the most important unsolved problem in the entire endeavor. Here is the physics of it. On Earth, you are protected by two overlapping systems that most people take completely for granted. The first is the magnetosphere, a vast, invisible magnetic bubble generated by the movement of molten iron in Earth's outer core. It extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space and deflects the vast majority of charged particles streaming from the Sun before they can reach the surface. The second layer of protection is the atmosphere itself, roughly 10 metric tons of air pressing down on every square meter of ground, thick enough to absorb most of what the magnetosphere misses. Together, these two systems reduce the radiation environment on Earth's surface to something the human body can handle across a normal lifespan. In deep space, in the void between Earth and Mars, neither of those systems exists. The moment a spacecraft leaves Earth's magnetic field, it enters an environment saturated with two distinct types of ionizing radiation. The first comes from the Sun, solar energetic particles, or SEEBs. During a solar event, a flare, a coronal mass ejection, the Sun can release a burst of high-energy protons that, without shielding, can deliver a lethal dose of radiation within hours. Mission planners track solar activity carefully and build radiation shelters into spacecraft designs for exactly this reason. SEEBs are dangerous, but they are somewhat predictable and somewhat manageable. The second type is the one that keeps researchers awake at night. Galactic cosmic rays, GCRs, do not come from the Sun. They come from outside our solar system entirely. They are the remnants of ancient stellar explosions. Supernovae accelerate to near light speed over millions of years and now traveling through the galaxy in every direction simultaneously. They are not a beam. They are a constant, omnidirectional rain of high-energy particles that never stops, never weakens, and cannot be fully blocked. The reason GCRs are so difficult to shield against is fundamental to the physics of how they interact with matter. When a GCR particle, typically a high-energy ion nucleus, strikes a material like aluminum or even water, it does not simply stop. It produces secondary radiation. The shielding itself becomes a source of radiation. Add more shielding, and in some configurations you can actually increase the radiation dose rather than reduce it. Researchers at the NASA Langley Research Center, along with scientists at laboratories around the world, have been studying this problem for decades. There is no clean engineering solution yet. So what does this actually mean in terms of numbers? The International Commission on Radiological Protection sets a lifetime occupational radiation dose limit for radiation workers on Earth. It is designed to keep the excess lifetime cancer risk below around 1%. For context, that limit is roughly 1 sievert, the unit used to measure biological radiation dose accumulated over an entire career. Now consider this. NASA's own data from the Curiosity rover's transit to Mars measured by the Radiation Assessment Detector instrument aboard the spacecraft, found that the round trip to Mars and back, in transit alone, would expose an astronaut to approximately 0.66 sieverts of radiation, and that is just transit. That number does not include time on the Martian surface, which has its own radiation environment, thanks to Mars's almost non-existent magnetic field and its thin atmosphere, which provides only about 1% of Earth's atmospheric protection. Total estimated radiation exposure for a complete Mars mission, transit there, surface stay, transit back, falls somewhere in the range of 1 sievert or more, depending on mission duration and solar conditions. For some crew members, it could be significantly higher. That is a career's worth of radiation exposure by Earth's safety standards, packed into a single mission. And here is the part that makes this more than just a number on a page. Ionizing radiation does not damage the human body the way a cut or a bruise does. It works at the level of individual cells, and specifically at the level of DNA. High-energy particles, particularly the heavy nuclei in galactic cosmic rays, travel through tissue like microscopic bullets, leaving trails of ionization damage along their path. DNA strands are severed, cell membranes are disrupted, the damage can trigger inflammation, accelerate cellular aging, and, most critically, create the kind of genomic instability that leads to cancer. But GCRs cause a different category of damage than the radiation types we encounter on Earth. Heavy ion radiation, the kind that dominates the GCR environment, produces densely ionizing tracks that the body's DNA repair mechanisms struggle to handle correctly. On Earth, our cells evolved efficient repair systems for the types of radiation that leak through the magnetosphere. For heavy ion tracks from ancient supernovae, those repair systems are far less reliable. Research conducted at the NASA Space Radiation Laboratory at Brookhaven National Laboratory, where scientists use particle accelerators to simulate GCR exposure in animal models, has shown consequences that extend well beyond cancer risk. In 2017, researchers published findings from studies in which mice were exposed to simulated GCR-level radiation. The results showed significant cognitive impairment, problems with spatial memory, behavioral flexibility, and anxiety-related responses. The neurons in the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and complex reasoning, showed measurable damage. Imagine an astronaut on their return journey from Mars. 18 months into the mission, they have absorbed a cumulative GCR dose that has been quietly reshaping the neural architecture of their prefrontal cortex. They are attempting to navigate re-entry, manage spacecraft systems, communicate with mission control across a signal delay that at certain orbital positions can stretch to over 20 minutes each way. And their cognitive performance is degraded in ways that neither they nor anyone on the ground can easily detect. This is not a scenario from science fiction. It is the extrapolation of real experimental data applied to a real mission profile, and the signal delay piece deserves its own attention because it is another dimension of the return problem that rarely gets the coverage it deserves. On the International Space Station, communication with the ground is essentially real time. There is a fraction of a second of delay, imperceptible, inconsequential. If something goes wrong on the ISS, mission control in Houston can be looped in within seconds. Astronauts are never truly alone in their decision-making. Mars is different. The distance between Earth and Mars changes constantly as both planets follow their own orbits. At closest approach, a moment called opposition, Mars is roughly 54 million kilometers away. At its farthest, it stretches to over 400 million kilometers. The average communication delay across a full mission cycles between roughly 3 minutes and 22 minutes each way, which means that if a medical emergency occurs on the return journey from Mars, if a crew member's blood pressure spikes dangerously, if there is a neurological event, if the spacecraft sustains damage during an in-space maneuver, the earliest possible response from Earth is 6 minutes. The more likely realistic response time is closer to 40 minutes round trip. In 40 minutes, an untreated cardiac event, a severe radiation sickness episode, or a critical system failure can progress from manageable to catastrophic. The astronaut crew is, in a very real sense, alone. And they are alone while carrying bodies that have been measurably altered by the journey. Weakened bones, a smaller heart, degraded vision, neural tissue that has been bombarded with particles from dead stars. All of this, every single challenge we have been laying out, is known, documented, being actively studied. The scientists working on this are not naive to these obstacles. They are not glossing over them. The research being done right now at institutions from NASA's Johnson Space Center to the European Space Agency's Human Spaceflight Division to university labs on multiple continents is specifically aimed at these exact problems, and some of the proposed solutions are extraordinary, not in a hand-wavy science fiction way, in a real peer-reviewed engineering review board way. Now we are going to start looking at the physiological countermeasures being seriously considered, including one proposal that sounds almost ancient in concept but has genuine scientific backing, and we are going to talk about the return window problem. The reason that even if you solve every biological challenge we have discussed so far, you cannot just leave Mars whenever you want. The universe has a schedule, and it does not care about yours. Let's talk about time, not in the poetic sense, in the orbital mechanics sense. Because one of the most underappreciated obstacles standing between a Mars astronaut and their return home has nothing to do with biology or radiation or engineering. It has to do with the geometry of two planets moving around a star at different speeds. Earth and Mars do not orbit the Sun in sync. Earth completes one orbit in 365 days. Mars takes roughly 687 Earth days, almost 2 full Earth years, to complete a single lap. Because of this difference in orbital speed, the relative positions of the two planets are constantly shifting, and that shifting creates a very specific, very narrow set of windows during which a spacecraft can travel between them efficiently. These are called launch windows, and for a Mars return mission, they occur roughly every 26 months. Here is what that means in practice. A crew lands on Mars. Their spacecraft, or more accurately, the Ascent vehicle that will carry them from the Martian surface back into orbit, is already waiting for them, sent ahead in a prior unmanned mission. Everything goes according to plan. They begin their surface research, and then, at some point during that surface stay, the launch window for the return trip opens. If they miss it, if a medical situation grounds a crew member, if the Ascent vehicle has a technical problem, if a dust storm delays operations past the critical departure date, the next opportunity to leave Mars efficiently does not come around for another 26 months. 26 months of additional surface time, additional radiation exposure, additional physical degradation, additional psychological pressure, living inside a habitat on a planet with a carbon dioxide atmosphere, temperatures that can swing from around 20 degrees Celsius at midday near the equator to negative 125 degrees Celsius at the poles on a winter night, and dust storms that can engulf the entire planet for weeks at a time, blotting out the sun so completely that solar power generation drops to nearly zero. The return window is not a soft deadline. In practical mission planning terms, it functions closer to an absolute one. Now let's talk about what happens inside a human mind when it confronts that kind of constraint. Behavioral health and performance, the formal term used by NASA's Human Research Program, is one of the 6 recognized risk categories for long-duration deep space missions. It sits alongside radiation, isolation, hostile environments, distance from Earth, and the gravitational transition challenges we discussed a bit ago. And in some ways, it may be the most difficult to quantify and the most dangerous to underestimate. Human beings are intensely social animals. We evolved in small groups, surrounded by other people, embedded in ecosystems rich with sensory variety, changing weather, natural light, wind, the sounds of other living things. Our nervous systems are calibrated for that kind of environment. They expect it, they require it. A Mars transit crew operates in a habitat that, depending on mission design, could be anywhere from around 500 to perhaps a few thousand cubic meters of enclosed space. The same walls, the same sounds, the same faces, for 6 to 9 months each way, with no ability to step outside, no natural light from a familiar sun. By the time a spacecraft reaches Mars, the Sun has shrunk to roughly a third of the angular size it appears from Earth, visibly dimmer, clearly farther away. The psychological research on isolated, confined environments gives us real data to work with here. Studies from Antarctic winter-over stations, where small teams spend months in total isolation from the outside world, consistently document a cluster of behavioral patterns that researchers call the third quarter phenomenon. Midway through the most isolated stretch of a mission, morale drops, irritability increases, cognitive performance declines, team cohesion fractures under the weight of prolonged close proximity and monotony. In 2019, a simulated Mars mission isolation study called Sirius, conducted in a habitat in Moscow with an international crew of 6, documented exactly these patterns. Interpersonal conflicts emerged, sleep quality degraded, performance on cognitive tests declined over time, and the crew had the option of emergency evacuation if things became genuinely dangerous. On a real Mars return journey, there is no emergency exit. There is a concept in human spaceflight psychology called third quarter phenomenon, but there is also a more acute version of that risk, what researchers call behavioral emergencies. These are episodes of psychological crisis severe enough to impair crew functioning, acute depression, panic episodes, psychosis triggered by the accumulated stress of confinement, or interpersonal conflicts that escalate to the point of physical danger. NASA and the space medicine community have studied historical analogues carefully. In the early days of long-duration spaceflight, there were incidents aboard Soviet space stations, documented in cosmonaut memoirs and later in declassified mission logs, of crew members experiencing serious psychological deterioration. One mission in the 1980s had to be terminated early in part because of behavioral health concerns. The tools for managing these crises on a Mars return mission are limited. Real-time consultations with Earth-based psychologists are constrained by that same 20-minute signal delay. Medications can be carried, but a comprehensive psychiatric formulary adds mass and has shelf-life limitations across a multi-year mission. And the very cognitive impairment we discussed in the context of radiation, the prefrontal cortex damage, the decline in behavioral flexibility, could reduce an affected crew member's ability to recognize or report their own deterioration. This is one reason why crew selection and pre-mission psychological assessment are taken so seriously in long-duration mission planning. But no amount of pre-screening eliminates the fundamental biological reality that the human nervous system was not built for this environment. And yet, here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because this is where human ingenuity starts pushing back. The biomedical research community is not standing still. There are real, funded, peer-reviewed efforts aimed at cracking some of these problems. And some of the most promising ideas come from directions you might not expect. Let's start with the fluid shift and SANS problem, the cerebrospinal pressure buildup that threatens vision and brain structure. One of the most actively investigated countermeasures is something called lower body negative pressure, or LBNP. The concept is almost elegantly simple. A sealed chamber around the lower half of the body applies a gentle vacuum, negative pressure that draws blood and fluids downward toward the legs. In doing so, it partially simulates the effect of gravity on fluid distribution without requiring actual gravity. Research conducted aboard the International Space Station, including work by French aerospace physician Guillemette Venture and her colleagues, has suggested that regular LBNP sessions during spaceflight could significantly reduce the upward fluid shift that drives SANS. Some studies showed measurable improvements in intracranial pressure profiles. This is not a solved problem, but it is a lead, a real, testable, promising lead. For bone and muscle loss, the research has converged on a combination of approaches. Advanced resistance exercise systems, like the Advanced Resistive Exercise device used on the ISS, allow astronauts to perform heavy resistance training even in microgravity, applying loads equivalent to their full body weight and more. Combined with targeted pharmaceutical interventions, bisphosphonates and other bone density preserving agents have been trialed in space. The rate of bone loss may be substantially reduced compared to early long-duration missions. And for radiation, the problem without an easy solution, there are several approaches being explored simultaneously. Pharmaceutical radioprotectants, some derived from compounds that evolved in radiation-resistant organisms, are being investigated for their ability to reduce DNA damage from GCR exposure. Water walls, spacecraft designs that use the crew's own water supply and waste as radiation shielding packed around the sleeping area, take advantage of hydrogen's relatively better performance against GCR particles compared to aluminum. And one emerging area of research looks at antioxidant-rich diets and specific nutritional interventions that may help the body's own repair systems keep pace with GCR-induced damage. None of these are silver bullets. All of them are being taken seriously by people whose professional lives are dedicated to solving this. But here is what all of those countermeasures share, and why the return problem is still fundamentally unsolved. Despite the genuine intelligence being poured into it, every single one of those interventions has to work continuously, in combination, over a duration that has never been tested in the actual environment where it matters. The ISS gives us data out to about a year, Scott Kelly's 340 days, and more recently Christina Koch's 328 days. A Mars return mission would need those interventions to work for potentially twice that long in a radiation environment significantly harsher than low Earth orbit, with a communication delay that makes real-time medical intervention impossible. It is the compounding of risks that defines the challenge. Not any single problem in isolation, but all of them together, acting on the same body at the same time for a longer duration than we have ever tested. Now, we are going to step back from the body itself, because there is one more dimension of the return problem that is structural, logistical, and in some ways the most audaciously complex engineering challenge in the history of human exploration. Getting off Mars, not traveling back to Earth, not the months in transit, just the first step, the moment where a crew sitting on the Martian surface has to climb into a vehicle and launch themselves off a planet with no launch infrastructure, no ground support, no fueling stations, no emergency recovery teams, no second chances. And we are going to look at what happened to one of the most carefully tested rocket propellant systems ever proposed for that task, and why the answer it gave us was more complicated than anyone wanted to hear. The surface of Mars is beautiful. It is also, in a very specific way, a trap. If you are enjoying this journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the thumbs up. Every video on this channel is built to give you a deeper, more honest look at the universe, to understand why leaving Mars is one of the hardest things a human being has ever attempted to engineer. you need to understand one fundamental asymmetry between Earth and Mars that shapes every decision in mission design. When a rocket launches from Earth, it does so surrounded by an entire civilization of support. There are fueling teams, launch control rooms staffed by hundreds of engineers, emergency response personnel, redundant communication systems, years of infrastructure built specifically to make that moment as safe and controlled as possible. The rocket itself was assembled in a facility with precision tools, climate control, and quality assurance processes refined over decades. If something goes wrong on the launch pad, people can intervene. Problems can be fixed. Launches can be scrubbed and rescheduled. On Mars, a crew attempting to return home has none of that. The Mars Ascent vehicle, the MAV in mission planning terminology, has to have been pre-deployed to the Martian surface before the crew even leaves Earth. It sits there on the surface of another planet for months or potentially years, exposed to temperature swings that can span more than 100 degrees Celsius within a single Martian day, exposed to dust that is so fine and so pervasive it works its way into every seal and every mechanism it contacts, exposed to ultraviolet radiation that streams through Mars's thin atmosphere without mercy. And then, when the crew is ready to leave, that vehicle, which no human hand has touched since it was built on Earth, has to work perfectly. On the first try, there is no repair crew on Mars. There is no replacement vehicle waiting on a nearby pad. If the MAV fails at ignition, the crew does not get a second launch attempt. They get a very long wait for a rescue mission that would take years to reach them, assuming one could be mounted at all. The propulsion choice for the MAV is therefore not just an engineering decision. It is a survival decision, and the history of that decision reveals just how brutally difficult the problem is. For years, one of the most seriously considered propellant combinations for the MAV was methane and liquid oxygen, often abbreviated as methalox. SpaceX has built its entire Starship architecture around methalox. It is energetically efficient, the exhaust is relatively clean, and critically, both methane and oxygen can theoretically be produced on Mars through a process called in-situ resource utilization, ISRU, using the carbon dioxide that makes up about 95% of the Martian atmosphere. The idea is elegant. Instead of launching all the propellant from Earth, which would add enormous mass to the initial mission, you send a propellant production plant to Mars ahead of the crew. It runs autonomously, pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, combining it with hydrogen brought from Earth or extracted from Martian ice deposits, and producing methane and liquid oxygen through a chemical reaction called the Sabatier process. By the time the crew arrives, the MAV is already fueled and waiting. In 2023, NASA's MOXIE experiment, the Mars Oxygen in Situ Resource Utilization experiment aboard the Perseverance rover, demonstrated that oxygen production from the Martian atmosphere is physically possible. Over the course of multiple operational runs, MOXIE produced oxygen at rates that, scaled up, suggested the technology could eventually support both crew breathing needs and propellant production. That was a genuine scientific triumph, a real proof of concept. Oxygen can be made on Mars, but making oxygen and methane reliably enough at sufficient scale to fuel a crewed ascent vehicle continuously for years of autonomous operation in an environment that destroys equipment in ways we have not fully characterized yet, that is a different challenge entirely, and it is one that remains unresolved. There is another propellant option that sidesteps the ISRU complexity: hypergolic propellants. These are fuel and oxidizer combinations that ignite spontaneously on contact with each other, no ignition system required, no spark, no timing mechanism that can fail. Hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide is the most commonly used hypergolic pair in spaceflight. It is what powered the descent engines of the Apollo lunar module. It is what powers the thrusters on countless satellites and spacecraft today. Hypergolics are reliable. That spontaneous ignition makes them extremely dependable in terms of startup, which is exactly what you want from a rocket that has been sitting alone on a cold planet for 2 years and needs to fire flawlessly on demand. But hypergolics have their own serious problems in the Mars context. Hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide are both extraordinarily toxic. Handling them requires specialized equipment, protective suits, and controlled environments. Fueling a MAV with hypergolics on Earth in a controlled launch facility is a highly managed operation. Fueling one autonomously on Mars in the Martian environment with no human operators present to manage a leak or a spill introduces risks that are genuinely frightening to think through. And then there is the density and energy question. Hypergolics are less energetically efficient than methalox, meaning you need more propellant mass to achieve the same velocity change. Getting off Mars requires reaching orbital velocity, roughly 4 kilometers per second. The MAV has to carry enough propellant to do that, plus enough margin for the trajectory corrections needed to rendezvous with the crew's return vehicle waiting in Mars' orbit. More propellant mass means a heavier vehicle. A heavier vehicle needs more propellant to lift it. The math compounds quickly. NASA's current reference architecture for the MAV has gone through multiple revisions. As of the most recent publicly available planning documents, the agency has been working toward a vehicle that uses a combination of propellant approaches, with the design still being actively refined. That is not a criticism. It is an honest reflection of how genuinely hard the problem is. And once the MAV fires successfully, once the crew has lifted off the Martian surface and reached orbit, the mission is not anywhere close to over, because now they have to find their return vehicle. The Earth Return Vehicle, or ERV, is orbiting Mars. It has been orbiting Mars autonomously, potentially for years. It is not a small object in a stable, well-characterized orbit. Mars's 2 moons, Phobos and Deimos, both small, irregularly shaped captured asteroids, create minor but real gravitational perturbations in spacecraft orbits over time. Solar radiation pressure, the gentle but persistent push of sunlight against the surface of the vehicle, causes additional orbital drift. The ERV has onboard propulsion to correct these perturbations, but those corrections consume propellant, and propellant in orbit is finite. The rendezvous between the MAV, a small, lightweight ascent vehicle climbing from the surface with limited maneuvering capability, and the ERV in Mars orbit is one of the most delicate and precisely choreographed maneuvers in the entire mission. The 2 vehicles have to arrive at the same point in space at the same time, at the same velocity, with enough margin for the crew to dock safely. Miss the rendezvous window if the MAV's trajectory is slightly off, or if the ERV has drifted from its expected position, and the options narrow very, very quickly. There are no tow trucks in Mars orbit. Let's zoom out for a moment, because there is a larger pattern worth naming. Every single challenge we have discussed in this video, the cardiovascular degradation, the bone loss, the SANS phenomenon, the radiation exposure, the psychological pressure, the orbital mechanics of the return window, the complexity of the MAV, the rendezvous problem, each one, individually, has a potential solution being worked on by brilliant, dedicated people. But a Mars return mission does not get to solve them individually. It has to solve all of them simultaneously in the same vehicle with the same crew, across the same timeline, with no rescue option and no abort-to-Earth capability. Once the spacecraft is beyond a certain distance, the Apollo program had an abort-to-Earth option at nearly every stage of the mission. The distance from Earth to the Moon, roughly 384,000 kilometers, meant that even in a worst-case scenario, a return trajectory could be calculated and executed within days. Apollo 13 demonstrated that in one of the most dramatic moments in the history of human exploration, a catastrophic oxygen tank failure transformed into a survival story by the combination of human ingenuity and the relatively forgiving geometry of the Earth-Moon system. Mars offers no equivalent grace. Once a crew is beyond a certain point in the transit, roughly the first few weeks of the journey, a direct abort back to Earth is no longer energetically feasible. The fuel required would exceed what any realistic spacecraft could carry. The crew is committed. Whatever happens next, they face it at the distance of Mars, with a signal delay of up to 22 minutes, and with bodies that are being changed by the environment in ways we are still working to fully understand. That is not a reason to give up on Mars. I want to be clear about that. The people working on these problems, the flight surgeons, the aerospace engineers, the psychologists and pharmacologists and radiation biologists, are not describing an impossible mission. They are describing an extraordinarily difficult one. And there is a meaningful difference between those two things. Difficult has been overcome before. The history of human spaceflight is, in many ways, a history of overcoming things that looked impossible until the moment someone figured out how to do them. But now, we are going to talk about something that sits in a different category from all the engineering and biology we have covered so far. Something that does not have a clear technical solution. Something that touches on what it means to be a person who has traveled to another world and then returned to this one. Because even if every biological challenge is managed, even if the MAV fires perfectly and the rendezvous goes flawlessly and the return transit is completed without a serious radiation event or a psychological crisis, even if the spacecraft enters Earth's atmosphere on schedule and the parachutes deploy and the capsule splashes down in the Pacific exactly where it is supposed to, even then, the journey is not over. What happens to the human being who comes back? What does Earth feel like to someone who has stood on another planet? What does it do to your sense of self, your sense of place, your relationship to every single thing you knew before you left, when you have seen this world from that distance, a pale blue-white point of light in a black sky? There is a name for what some astronauts report experiencing after returning from space, and the Mars version of it may be something we do not yet have the language to describe. There is a photograph taken by the Voyager 1 spacecraft on February 14, 1990, from a distance of roughly 6 billion kilometers away from Earth. Carl Sagan had advocated for years to have the camera turned back toward the inner solar system before the spacecraft crossed into the outer dark. NASA agreed, and on that day, Earth appeared in the image as a tiny, pale blue dot, less than a single pixel in size, suspended in a beam of scattered sunlight. Sagan wrote about that image in ways that have stayed with millions of people for decades. He described our planet as a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. He wrote that every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, every inventor and explorer, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived out their lives on that tiny point of light. Now imagine seeing something like that, not in a photograph, not on a screen, but with your actual eyes, through an actual window. From the surface of another world, astronauts returning from the International Space Station from an altitude of roughly 400 kilometers already report something. A shift in perception, a change in how they relate to the planet, to borders, to the conflicts and categories that feel so large and so urgent from the ground. There is a term for this in the psychological literature, the overview effect, first described and named by writer Frank White in his 1987 book of the same name, based on interviews with astronauts who struggled to articulate what the view from orbit did to their inner landscape. From Mars, Earth is not a globe filling the sky. It is a bright star, a bluish point of light, similar in appearance to how Venus looks from our surface, small, luminous, utterly beautiful, and inconceivably far away. Everything you have ever known, everyone you have ever loved, the entirety of recorded human history, visible in one glance as a single point of light in a black sky. What does that do to a person? The honest answer is that we do not fully know yet. We can extrapolate from what we already understand about the overview effect in lower orbit astronauts. We can look at the psychological literature on profound perspective shifts. We can look at what long Antarctic expeditions do to the people who return from them. But the Mars experience, the actual phenomenology of standing on another planet and looking up at a tiny Earth, is something no human being has yet had. What we do have is testimony from astronauts who have been to the Moon. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth person to walk on the lunar surface during Apollo 14, described the return journey from the Moon in terms that his engineering background had never prepared him to articulate. He reported an experience of sudden, overwhelming interconnectedness, a visceral sense that the universe was somehow in some way conscious, or at least coherent, in a way that transcended the mechanical model he had been trained to inhabit. He spent the rest of his life trying to study that experience scientifically through his Institute of Noetic Sciences. Rusty Schweickart, who performed a spacewalk during Apollo 9, described the sensation of floating above Earth without the framework of a mission task to focus on, of simply being there, connected to everything below by the thinnest imaginable thread, as one of the most spiritually disorienting and profound experiences a human being can have. These were men who traveled to the Moon and back, a journey measured in days. At a distance of 384,000 kilometers, Mars is, at its closest, 54 million kilometers away. The return journey from Mars takes months. The psychological distance, the felt sense of separation from home, is not simply proportional. It may be categorically different. Researchers at the University of Hawaii and at other institutions have studied what happens to people during long-duration isolation in Mars analog environments, habitat simulations, designed to approximate the psychological conditions of a Mars mission as closely as possible on Earth. The HICS program, the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation, ran a series of missions between 2013 and 2018 in which small crews lived in a dome on the slopes of Mauna Loa, isolated from the outside world, operating under simulated communication delays with the outside world. What the researchers found was nuanced and important. Crews did not simply deteriorate over time. The experience was not uniformly negative. Many participants reported moments of genuine transcendence, of profound connection with their small team, of a deepened appreciation for simple pleasures, of a clarity about what actually matters in a human life that they had never felt before. But they also reported something that emerged consistently across multiple missions: a growing difficulty in imagining returning, not a fear of the return journey itself, but a kind of identity drift, a sense that the person who would step back into normal Earth life at the end of the mission was not quite the same person who had stepped into the habitat at the beginning, that the framework of ordinary life, the traffic, the news cycle, the social media, the ambient noise of civilization had become somehow harder to relate to, more alien in a quiet way than the simulation they were living in. One High Seas crew member described it this way in a post-mission interview: returning to Earth felt, paradoxically, like arriving somewhere unfamiliar. Now extend that sensation across a real Mars mission. A crew member has been gone from Earth for somewhere between 2 and 3 years. They have spent months in transit in a small habitat with the same small team in both directions. They have lived on the surface of another planet. They have breathed recycled air and eaten engineered food. and watched the sun shrink in the sky as the months passed. They have looked up at night and seen Earth as a point of light indistinguishable to the naked eye from the stars around it, and then they come home. Their family has aged. Their friends have moved forward through their lives. Children who were young when they left are noticeably older. Technology has shifted. Cultural references have accumulated that they have no context for. The world has continued at its own pace, while the returning crew member experienced time in an environment so removed from that pace that resynchronizing is not simply a matter of catching up on news. Post-mission reintegration is a recognized challenge in long-duration spaceflight. NASA and the European Space Agency both provide psychological support and structured reintegration programs for returning ISS astronauts. Scott Kelly, after his year in space, wrote extensively about how strange and disorienting ordinary sensory experiences felt in the days and weeks after return: the smell of fresh air, the weight of his own body, the sound of rain, sensations that most people experience as unremarkable background details of daily life, were for him suddenly vivid and overwhelming. For a Mars returnee, those sensations would be arriving after roughly twice the duration of Kelly's mission, and they would be arriving in a body that, regardless of how effective the countermeasures had been measurably and permanently changed by the journey. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. We are made of stardust. That is not a metaphor. The calcium in the bones we talked about losing in microgravity was forged in the core of a dying star. The iron that carries oxygen through our blood was scattered across space by a supernova explosion billions of years before our solar system existed. The carbon that forms the backbone of every molecule in every cell of every human body was created in the nuclear furnace of ancient stars. We are, in the most literal sense possible, the universe becoming aware of itself. Temporary arrangements of stellar debris that have, against all statistical expectation, organized themselves into creatures capable of looking up at the sky and asking where they came from. And the people who will one day stand on the surface of Mars and look back at the pale blue point of their origin will carry all of that history in their cells. The stardust and the evolution and the billions of years of planetary biology that shaped them for a world they are no longer standing on. That is extraordinary. It is also, in a very specific physiological sense, a problem, because the stardust that built us here, for this gravity, for this magnetic field, for this radiation environment, for this atmosphere, we are exquisitely, specifically, precisely adapted to Earth, and that adaptation is exactly what makes leaving it so difficult and returning from Mars so uncertain. But there is another dimension to the return that we have not addressed yet, one that operates not on the level of individual psychology or individual physiology, but on the level of planetary biology itself. When a crew returns from Mars, they are not returning alone. Even if every crew member is in perfect health, even if the mission has been a complete success by every engineering and medical metric, the spacecraft and its occupants will have spent months on the surface of a planet about which we still have a profound and important open question. Is Mars alive? Not in the science fiction sense, in the microbiology sense, because the question of whether Mars harbors life or has harbored it in the past is genuinely scientifically open. And if the answer turns out to be yes, even in the form of dormant microbial spores sheltering from radiation in subsurface rock or in the briny liquid water that radar data from the Mars Express orbiter has suggested may exist beneath the southern polar ice cap, then a returning Mars crew represents something that planetary protection protocols take extremely seriously. The possibility of biological contamination in both directions is real enough that it has shaped international space policy for decades. Let's start with a number that puts everything into perspective. 4 billion. That is roughly how many years life has existed on Earth. 4 billion years of unbroken biological continuity, an uninterrupted chain of living organisms, each one descended from the last, stretching back to the first self-replicating molecules that emerged in the chemistry of the early ocean. Every bacterium, every fungus, every plant, every animal, every human being who has ever drawn breath, all of us connected by that single unbroken thread. In 4 billion years, life on Earth has never, not once, encountered biology from another world. Every organism that has ever evolved here has done so in complete biological isolation from the rest of the universe. Our immune systems, our ecosystems, our entire biosphere developed in a sealed laboratory. The pathogens that challenge us evolved alongside us. The defenses we carry were shaped by the threats we faced. The relationship between Earth life and Earth disease is a dance that has been choreographed over geological timescales. Now consider what it would mean to introduce something genuinely new into that system. Not a new strain of a familiar pathogen, not a virus that jumped from one species to another, the way we have seen happen throughout history. Something truly novel, something that evolved in a completely separate biological context, under completely different chemical and environmental conditions, with no shared evolutionary history with anything on this planet. The word scientists use for this scenario is forward contamination when it travels from Earth to Mars, and backward contamination when it travels from Mars to Earth. And the institutional framework that exists to prevent both of these things from happening is called planetary protection. Planetary protection is not a fringe concern. It is codified in international space law, specifically in Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which commits spacefaring nations to the pursuit of exploration in a manner that avoids harmful contamination of celestial bodies and adverse changes to the Earth's environment. The treaty does not specify how to achieve this. That is left to scientific bodies and national space agencies, but the legal obligation is real and binding. NASA operates under a planetary protection policy developed and maintained by an office specifically dedicated to it. Missions to Mars are classified under what is called Category 4 or Category 5, depending on whether they carry life detection instruments and whether they involve sample return. Category 5, the highest level of concern, applies to any mission that brings material from Mars back to Earth. A crewed return mission would be Category 5 by definition. Every crew member, every piece of equipment, every gram of material that has been on the Martian surface would need to be treated, from a planetary protection standpoint, as a potential biological hazard. What does that actually look like in practice? The Mars Sample Return Program, an ongoing collaborative effort between NASA and the European Space Agency, designed to bring carefully selected rock and soil samples from Mars back to Earth using robotic spacecraft, has been planning for this challenge for years. The plan involves receiving those samples in a dedicated sample receiving facility, a biocontainment laboratory designed to handle the material at a biosafety level at least equivalent to BSL-4, the highest level used for the most dangerous known pathogens on Earth. The samples would be studied in isolation under strict containment by researchers who would themselves be subject to strict protocols. Now apply that framework to a crewed return mission. Not a sealed container of rock samples, but 6 human beings who have spent months breathing Martian dust, working in the Martian environment, potentially in direct contact with Martian subsurface material. If drilling or excavation activities were part of the mission, the logistical and ethical complexity of quarantining 6 returning crew members, people, not samples, at BSL-4 equivalent conditions is staggering to think through. Apollo offered a precedent, though perhaps not a reassuring one. The crews of Apollo 11, 12, and 14 were quarantined upon return from the Moon. held in the mobile quarantine facility, a converted Airstream trailer, for 21 days after splashdown. The scientific community at the time genuinely did not know whether the moon harbored any form of life or biologically active material. The quarantine was a precautionary measure taken under genuine uncertainty. After extensive study of lunar samples, the scientific consensus settled on the conclusion that the moon is biologically inert, no life, no biologically active compounds of concern. NASA ended the lunar quarantine protocol after Apollo 14. Mars is a fundamentally different situation. The moon is a geologically dead, airless, radiation-blasted world with no liquid water and no known history of conditions that could support life as we understand it. Mars, by contrast, has a documented history of liquid water on its surface. The Curiosity and Perseverance rovers have found organic molecules, the carbon-based building blocks of biology, preserved in Martian sedimentary rock. The Mars Express Orbiter's Merciless radar instrument has detected what appears to be a subglacial liquid water reservoir beneath the southern polar ice cap, roughly 20 kilometers across. The Martian subsurface, shielded from surface radiation, maintains temperatures and pressure conditions that could, theoretically, support certain extremophilic microorganisms. We do not know whether Mars has life, but the honest scientific position is that we cannot currently rule it out. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes backward contamination a serious concern rather than a theoretical one. Here is the part that rarely gets discussed openly. If Martian microorganisms exist, and they almost certainly would be microbial, given the challenging conditions, they would have evolved in a biological context completely isolated from Earth's. Their biochemistry might share some features with Earth life, if both originated from a common ancestor, a possibility that the panspermia hypothesis takes seriously, given that rocks are regularly exchanged between planets through meteorite impacts. Or their biochemistry might be entirely novel, different amino acid configurations, different membrane chemistry, different metabolic pathways. Either scenario has profound implications for backward contamination risk. If Martian life shares biochemical ancestry with Earth life, then cross-reactivity, the ability of Martian organisms to interact with Earth biology in ways that mirror how Earth pathogens behave, becomes conceivable. A microorganism that evolved under Martian conditions but shares fundamental biochemistry with Earth organisms might, under the right circumstances, find Earth's biosphere recognizable enough to colonize. If Martian life is entirely biochemically novel, the risk profile is different but not necessarily smaller. Earth immune systems evolved to recognize and respond to threats with certain molecular signatures. A completely novel biochemistry might be invisible to those defenses, not because it is particularly aggressive, but simply because it is unrecognizable. It is critical to say clearly here that this is not a prediction. The probability of a worst-case contamination scenario is genuinely unknown, which is precisely the point. Unknown probability combined with potentially catastrophic consequence is exactly the risk profile that demands the most conservative possible approach. The planetary protection scientists who have studied this most carefully do not describe it as likely, they describe it as too important to get wrong. And here is where the human dimension of the return becomes genuinely agonizing. Imagine a crew that has successfully completed a Mars mission. They have achieved something that no human being has ever done. They have stood on another planet, conducted research that will reshape our understanding of the solar system, and survived a journey of extraordinary physical and psychological difficulty. They are, in every meaningful sense, heroes of the highest order, and they cannot simply come home. They have to be quarantined. For how long? That question does not currently have a scientifically settled answer. The 21-day Apollo quarantine was based on reasonable but somewhat arbitrary assumptions about incubation periods. For a genuinely novel Martian biology, if it exists, we would have no incubation period data to draw on. Determining a safe quarantine duration for returning Mars crew members would require exactly the kind of scientific investigation that the quarantine itself is meant to enable. In the interim, the crew would be held in isolation, separated from the families they have not seen in 2 to 3 years, unable to receive visitors, unable to walk outside, unable to experience the natural world that their stardust bodies are so specifically calibrated for. After everything they have endured, the radiation, the confinement, the physical degradation, the psychological pressure, the profound perspective shift of having seen Earth as a distant star, the first thing they receive upon returning to the planet of their birth is a cell. That is not hyperbole. That is the honest, logical conclusion of taking planetary protection seriously. And taking it seriously is the right thing to do. There is a broader philosophical point embedded in all of this that I think is worth naming: the challenges of returning from Mars. Biological, neurological, psychological, orbital, mechanical, engineering-based, and now planetary protection-based, all point toward the same underlying truth. Leaving Earth is not a simple extension of exploration the way crossing an ocean was. It is a departure from the specific set of conditions that produced us. Every kilometer away from this planet is a kilometer further from the gravitational field, the radiation environment, the biological context, and the chemical conditions that assembled us out of stardust over 4 billion years. We can go. The physics allow it. The engineering, though dauntingly difficult, is not impossible. The biology, though genuinely alarming in places, may be manageable with sufficient investment and research. But we cannot go unchanged, and we cannot come back unchanged. The universe does not offer that particular grace. Carl Sagan, whose photograph of the pale blue dot we opened this part with, spent much of his life arguing that space exploration was not a luxury but a necessity, that the long-term survival of our species depended on becoming multiplanetary. He held that view with clear eyes about the difficulty and the danger. He was not naive about what it would cost, what he understood, and what the science we have been laying out across these parts illuminates is that the cost is not just financial or technological. It is biological, it is psychological, it is existential in the most literal sense. It touches on the question of what we are and what we are willing to become in order to survive. Let's be honest about something that does not get said clearly enough in public conversations about Mars exploration. The timelines are slipping, not because the people working on this are not brilliant enough, or dedicated enough, or funded enough, though funding is always a conversation worth having. They are slipping because the problems are harder than early optimism suggested, because the human body keeps revealing new vulnerabilities that engineering alone cannot solve, because the gap between what we can build and what biology actually requires keeps demanding more work, more time, more humility from the people doing the planning. In 2010, NASA's Authorization Act set a goal of reaching Mars by the mid-2030s. In 2017, that goal was reaffirmed with similar language. As of the most recent publicly available NASA planning documents and budget discussions, a crewed Mars landing, not a return mission, just a landing, remains aspirationally targeted for the late 2030s to early 2040s, contingent on sustained political will, consistent funding, and successful development of several critical technologies that do not yet exist at operational readiness. SpaceX has been more aggressive in its public statements. Elon Musk has described timelines for Starship missions to Mars beginning in the late 2020s, with crewed missions potentially following in the early 2030s. Those timelines have shifted repeatedly over the years as the engineering reality of building and flying Starship has imposed its own schedule. Starship's development has been genuinely impressive. The vehicle has reached orbital velocity, demonstrated booster catch maneuvers at the Jekkazilla Tower at Starbase in Texas, and shown capabilities that no other rocket in history has matched. But impressive progress and operational readiness for a crewed interplanetary mission are two very different things. What would operational readiness for a crewed Mars return mission actually require, based on where the science and engineering currently stand? Let's go through it systematically first. The radiation problem needs a substantially better solution than currently exists. The pharmaceutical radioprotectants being investigated are promising but not yet proven at the dose levels and durations required for a Mars mission. The shielding problem, the fundamental physics challenge of blocking galactic cosmic rays without generating secondary radiation, remains unsolved at the engineering level for a crewed vehicle. Some researchers have proposed that a water shield surrounding the crew sleeping quarters with a roughly 50-centimeter layer of water could reduce GCR dose by a meaningful percentage. Others have investigated magnetic shielding, generating an artificial magnetic field around the spacecraft to deflect charged particles the way Earth's magnetosphere deflects them. The energy requirements for a sufficiently strong active magnetic shield are significant, and the technology is not yet close to flight ready until the radiation problem is solved. Not managed, but genuinely solved to a level where the lifetime cancer risk and the neurological damage risk fall within acceptable bounds. Sending people to Mars and expecting them to return in good health is, in the frank assessment of the radiation biology community, an open question with an uncomfortable answer. Second, the SANS problem needs a reliable, validated countermeasure that works across the full duration of a Mars mission. Lower body negative pressure is the most promising lead, but it has been tested in relatively short spaceflight durations. A controlled study of LBMP efficacy across an 18-month or 24-month mission profile has not been conducted because no human being has spent that long in the relevant environment. The ISS gives us data up to about a year. Beyond that, we are extrapolating from shorter data sets, which is scientifically defensible but not the same as having the evidence in hand. Third, the Mars Ascent vehicle needs to be built, tested and proven, not just tested on Earth, tested in the actual Martian environment, with the actual propellant production system running autonomously across the actual duration of a real mission timeline. NASA has awarded contracts for MAV development and serious engineering work is underway, but as of now, no MAV has ever been deployed to Mars, let alone fired. The first time that vehicle's engine ignites on the Martian surface, a human crew's life will depend on it working perfectly. And now, the thing I mentioned earlier, the development that may matter more than any of the engineering solutions listed above. It has to do with time, specifically with what time does to cells. One of the most significant and least discussed biological risks of a long-duration Mars mission is accelerated cellular aging. The combination of radiation exposure, microgravity stress, disrupted circadian rhythms, psychological pressure, and altered nutrition creates a cellular environment in which the normal processes of biological aging appear to speed up. Telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes that shorten naturally with each cell division and serve as a kind of biological clock, show changes in spaceflight that are not fully consistent with simple aging acceleration, but that reflect genuine genomic stress. Scott Kelly's twins study, in which his identical twin brother Mark Kelly, a fellow astronaut, remained on Earth during Scott's year in space, gave researchers an extraordinary controlled data set. Some of Scott's telomeres actually lengthened during spaceflight, which was unexpected, but then shortened rapidly upon return. The study found changes in gene expression, the way genes are turned on and off, that persisted for months after the mission ended. Cognitive performance showed measurable decline, and the researchers noted explicitly that a Mars duration mission would expose crew members to these biological pressures for a significantly longer period, with potentially more lasting consequences. The field of research that addresses this at the deepest level is called senescence biology. Cellular senescence is the process by which cells stop dividing and enter a state of permanent arrest. Not dead, but no longer functional in the way healthy cells are. Senescent cells accumulate with age and with stress. They secrete inflammatory compounds that damage surrounding tissue. They contribute to the deterioration of organ function, and they appear to accumulate more rapidly under the conditions of spaceflight. In the past decade, a class of experimental drugs called senolytics has emerged as one of the most exciting areas in longevity research. Senolytics selectively clear senescent cells from tissue, essentially helping the body remove the biological debris of stress and aging. Animal studies have shown remarkable results. Senolytic treatment in mice has reversed measurable aspects of aging, improved physical function, extended healthy lifespan, and reduced inflammation markers. Human clinical trials for senolytics are underway. The Mayo Clinic, the University of Minnesota, and other institutions are running studies on senolytic compounds in conditions associated with accelerated cellular aging. The results so far are early but genuinely encouraging. If senolytic therapies could be validated and developed to the point where they could be safely administered during a Mars mission, clearing the biological accumulation of spaceflight stress from crew members' tissue in real time, across the duration of the journey, they could represent a genuine paradigm shift in what the human body can tolerate in deep space. This is not science fiction. It is early-stage science. There is a meaningful difference and it matters, but senolytics alone are not enough, because there is one more category of challenge that we have touched on in earlier parts, but not yet fully examined. And it may be the most practically limiting factor of all when it comes to a realistic Mars return mission timeline. It is the question of medical capability. A crew on a Mars return journey is, for all practical purposes, their own medical team. Signal delay to Earth makes real-time consultation with physicians essentially impossible for acute emergencies. The crew has to be able to diagnose, treat, and recover from any medical event that occurs during the mission. With whatever equipment and medications were brought along, and with whatever medical training the crew has been given. Consider the range of medical events that could occur across a 2 to 3 year mission. Appendicitis, kidney stones, a risk that is actually elevated in spaceflight due to the altered fluid dynamics and calcium metabolism we discussed earlier, dental emergencies, bone fractures, increasingly likely given the skeletal fragility that accumulates in microgravity, cardiac arrhythmias, a documented risk in long-duration spaceflight that researchers believe is related to the electrolyte imbalances caused by fluid redistribution, surgical emergencies of any kind, which are extraordinarily difficult to manage in microgravity, where blood behaves differently than it does under gravity, and where maintaining a sterile field is a significant challenge. The medical kit a Mars crew carries has to be comprehensive enough to handle all of these scenarios, but every kilogram of medical equipment is a kilogram that has to be launched from Earth, transported across interplanetary space, and carried throughout the mission. Mass is the fundamental currency of spaceflight. Everything costs mass, and mass costs propellant, and propellant costs more mass to carry the propellant. There is a concept in mission planning called the tyranny of the rocket equation. It was articulated mathematically by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in the late 1800s, one of the founding fathers of theoretical astronautics, working in relative obscurity in a small Russian town, deriving the fundamental mathematics of rocket propulsion decades before anyone built a rocket capable of reaching orbit. Tsiolkovsky's equation describes the relationship between the mass of a rocket, the mass of its propellant, and the velocity change it can achieve. The equation is merciless. To go faster or farther, you need more propellant, but more propellant means more mass. More mass means you need even more propellant to move that mass. The propellant needed to carry, the propellant needed to carry, the propellant grows exponentially. Every kilogram added to a Mars mission, whether it is medical equipment, radiation shielding, food, psychological comfort items, or scientific instruments, cascades through the entire mission architecture, demanding more propellant, more launch capacity, more cost. This is why Mars mission designers speak of mass budgets with the same intensity that financial planners speak of monetary ones. Every gram is negotiated. Every system is stripped to its minimum viable weight. The medical kit that a Mars crew can carry is not determined by what would be ideal. It is determined by what can be justified within the mass budget, alongside everything else the mission requires. And within those constraints, the honest assessment is that a Mars crew would be operating with medical capabilities significantly below what we consider baseline standard of care in any functioning hospital on Earth. That tension between what the mission requires and what the physics allows runs through every aspect of the Mars return problem, and it leads to a question that mission architects, ethicists, and space medicine researchers are genuinely wrestling with right now. At what point is the risk acceptable? Not zero. The risk will never be zero. Every human expedition into unknown territory has carried risk that would be considered unacceptable by modern safety standards applied retrospectively. The explorers who crossed unknown oceans, who pushed into polar regions, who climbed mountains that had never been climbed. They accepted risks of death and permanent injury that we look back on with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. Mars will require that same category of risk acceptance. The question is whether the people making the decision to accept it, the astronauts themselves, the agencies sending them, the societies funding the missions, are making that decision with fully honest eyes about what the science actually says, because there is a version of the Mars conversation that sanitizes the biology, that presents the challenges as solved or nearly solved or solvable with a little more engineering, that focuses on the majesty of the destination and softens the brutality of what the journey will demand from the human bodies that undertake it. And there is another version, the one we have been building across these 7 parts, that looks at the peer-reviewed data, the mission planning documents, the radiation biology, the neuroscience, the orbital mechanics, and the planetary protection protocols, and says, this is extraordinary, this is achievable, this is worth pursuing with everything we have, and it is also the hardest thing our species has ever attempted. Both things are true simultaneously. If you are still watching, then this channel was made exactly for you. Every day we ask the questions most people are afraid to sit with, and we go all the way to the answer. In 2013, a Dutch non-profit organization called Mars One announced an audacious plan. They would send human beings to Mars on a one-way trip, no return vehicle, no return mission, no promise of ever coming home. Colonists, that was the word they used, would travel to Mars and spend the rest of their lives there, building the first permanent human settlement on another world. The response was staggering. More than 200,000 people from over 140 countries submitted applications, not curiosity inquiries, not casual expressions of interest, formal applications with personal statements explaining why they wanted to leave Earth forever and never return. 200,000 people said yes to a one-way ticket to Mars. Mars One ultimately collapsed. The organization ran out of funding. Its technical plans were widely criticized by engineers and mission planners as severely underdeveloped, and the whole venture was eventually declared bankrupt in 2019. But the applications remain one of the most remarkable data points in the entire history of human exploration, because what they reveal is something that no rocket equation and no radiation biology study can fully account for. There is something in a significant portion of the human population that looks at the idea of leaving Earth permanently, of never again breathing open air, never again seeing a natural horizon, never again experiencing rain or seasons or the particular quality of light on an ordinary afternoon, and says, I would do that, to be there, to be first, to be part of something that large. That is not pathology. That is exploration drive at its most pure and most extreme expression. And understanding it is essential to understanding the full picture of the Mars return problem, because the human element of these missions is not separate from the engineering and biology. It is woven through every decision, every risk calculation, every policy debate about what is acceptable and what is not. Let's talk about some of the real people who have signed on or who have been seriously considered for Mars missions under programs that were honest about the difficulty of the return. NASA's astronaut corps currently includes individuals who have specifically trained and prepared for long-duration deep space missions. The Artemis program, NASA's ongoing effort to return humans to the Moon, is explicitly framed as a stepping stone to Mars. The astronauts being trained under Artemis are, in a meaningful sense, the first generation of the Mars generation. They are the people whose medical data will inform the protocols, whose physical responses to long-duration spaceflight will shape the countermeasures, whose psychological profiles will help define what it takes to go that far and come back. Among them are people who have spoken publicly and with remarkable clarity about what they are willing to accept. Christina Koch, who set the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, spending 328 days aboard the International Space Station, has spoken about the experience of long-duration isolation and physical challenge with an honesty that is genuinely striking. She has described the moment of return to Earth after nearly a year in space, the overwhelming sensory reintroduction to gravity, to air, to the smell of the planet, as one of the most profound experiences of her life, and she has made clear that she would go further, longer, into deeper space. Frank Rubio, who spent 371 days aboard the ISS after his planned 6-month mission was extended due to a coolant leak in his Soyuz return vehicle, making him the American record holder for longest single spaceflight, has spoken about the psychological reality of an unexpectedly extended mission with the kind of calm, grounded honesty that comes from having actually lived through it. His mission was not planned to be that long. The extension was not his choice, and he handled it, and he came back. And his testimony about what the body and mind can endure under the right conditions, with the right preparation and the right support structure, matters enormously for what Mars mission planners are trying to understand. But there is a category of volunteer that goes beyond the professional astronaut corps, beyond the formally selected and intensively trained mission specialists whose entire careers have prepared them for this environment. There are private citizens who have committed, publicly and financially, to going to Mars under SpaceX's Starship architecture. Yusaku Maezawa, the Japanese entrepreneur and art collector, purchased a flight around the Moon on a future Starship mission under the program called Dear Moon, which has since been cancelled. But his willingness to pay for and publicly commit to that journey and his stated desire to eventually go further reflects something real about how the conversation around Mars exploration has shifted. It is no longer purely a government endeavor. It is becoming a human one in the broadest possible sense, extending beyond the small, elite community of professionally trained government astronauts to include a wider population of people who are, quite simply, willing despite the radiation, willing despite the bone loss and the cardiac changes and the vision degradation and the psychological pressure, willing despite the orbital mechanics and the launch windows and the Ascent vehicle complexity and the rendezvous problem, willing, in some cases, even if the return is not guaranteed. What do we do with that willingness? This is where the ethics of Mars exploration become genuinely complicated in ways that deserve serious thought rather than easy answers. On one side of the argument sits the principle of autonomy. Adult human beings have the right to make informed decisions about their own lives, including decisions that carry significant personal risk. Free solo climbers accept the real possibility of death. Deep-sea divers accept risks that most people would find unacceptable. Test pilots, in the early days of aviation, flew machines that killed their colleagues regularly and kept flying. The history of exploration is inseparable from the history of people choosing to accept risks that others would not. If a group of human beings, fully informed about the radiation exposure, the cardiovascular degradation, the neurological risks, the planetary protection quarantine, the return window constraints, the Ascent vehicle uncertainties, looks at all of that and says, yes, I accept these terms, I want to go, what grounds does anyone have to say no? On the other side sits a more complicated set of concerns about institutional responsibility. The agencies and companies sending these people bear a moral obligation to ensure that the risk is as low as it can reasonably be made before asking anyone to accept it. About the limits of informed consent when we are asking people to accept risks that are not yet fully characterized, because some of what GCR radiation does to the human brain over 2+ years is still genuinely unknown, and you cannot fully consent to something you cannot fully be told. And about the public dimension of these missions, they are not purely private decisions. They will be funded, at least in part, by public resources. Their outcomes, success or failure, triumph or tragedy, will shape the future of human spaceflight for generations. These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are being actively debated in space medicine ethics literature, in congressional budget hearings, in mission planning meetings. The people closest to this work are not naive to them. There is one more human dimension that I want to spend some time on because it connects everything we have been discussing to something much larger than any individual mission. We are living through what many historians and scientists believe is a genuinely pivotal moment in the history of our species. A moment when, for the first time in 4 billion years of life on Earth, one species has developed the capability, primitive and difficult and genuinely dangerous as it currently is, to leave its home planet and reach another one. That capability did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged from the same 4 billion years of evolution we have been talking about throughout this video, the same biological heritage that makes spaceflight so hard on the human body. The brain that designed the rocket also evolved in 1g of gravity. The hands that built the MAV also carry the calcium that microgravity dissolves. The minds that calculated the orbital mechanics of the return window are housed in skulls that fill with cerebrospinal fluid pressure when gravity is removed. We built the means of departure out of the same material that makes departure dangerous. That is a profound irony, and it is also a profound source of hope, because it means that the intelligence capable of solving these problems is not separate from the biological system that faces them. It is the same system, turned on itself in an act of extraordinary self-examination and self-transcendence. Carl Sagan wrote that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself, that in the human mind, the universe has produced something that can look back at its own history, trace its own origins, and ask, with genuine scientific rigor and genuine emotional depth, what am I, and where did I come from, and where am I going? The Mars return mission is that question made physical, made architectural, made biological. It is the universe, through us, reaching out across the void toward one of its own worlds, and asking whether it can touch it and come back changed but intact, transformed but alive. Whether the answer is yes depends on problems we have not yet fully solved. But it also depends on something that the equations and the clinical studies and the mission planning documents cannot capture. Whether we decide that the answer matters enough to find it, history suggests we will. History suggests that the combination of curiosity, courage, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept the current limits of the possible is the most reliable force our species has ever generated. But history also teaches, in the clearest possible terms, that courage without preparation is not heroism, it is waste. The people who will eventually stand on Mars and attempt to return deserve every answer that science can give them before they go. They deserve the radiation countermeasure that works. They deserve the MAV that has been tested. They deserve the medical capability that can handle what the journey will do to their bodies. They deserve the honest conversation, not the sanitized one. That conversation is what we have been having across this video. Let's build it, step by step. A realistic Mars return mission, not the brochure version, not the nightmare version, but the honest version. The one grounded in what the science actually supports and what the engineering actually allows. Right now, at this moment in human history, we begin not on Mars. We begin years before anyone leaves Earth. The mission starts, in any realistic architecture, somewhere between 8 and 12 years before the first human being sets foot on Martian soil. It starts in the laboratories, in simulation chambers, in analog environments designed to approximate the physical and psychological conditions of the journey as closely as the surface of Earth allows. It starts with a medical research program unlike anything ever undertaken in the history of human spaceflight, more comprehensive, more longitudinal, more brutally honest about its own uncertainties than the programs that preceded it. The crew candidates undergo years of baseline physiological mapping, not just standard astronaut medical exams, deep, detailed, genomic-level profiling, identifying which individuals carry genetic variants that make them more or less susceptible to radiation-induced DNA damage, to bone density loss, to cerebrospinal fluid pressure buildup, to the particular constellation of cardiovascular changes that microgravity accelerates. This is not discrimination, it is precision medicine applied to the most demanding occupational environment ever conceived. The goal is to select and prepare a crew whose specific biological profiles give them the best possible chance of completing the mission and returning in health that can be meaningfully rehabilitated. Simultaneously, the hardware begins its journey to Mars years before the crew does. The Earth return vehicle launches first, a large autonomously operated spacecraft that enters Mars orbit and begins its long wait. Its systems are designed for years of autonomous operation with redundancy layered upon redundancy. Its propellant reserves are carefully managed by onboard software that accounts for orbital decay, solar pressure, and the occasional correction burn needed to maintain a stable orbit. When the crew eventually arrives at Mars, the ERV has been orbiting for 2 years or more. Every system has been checked. Every backup has been verified. The crew is not meeting this vehicle for the first time. They have trained with its exact digital twin for years. The Mars Ascent vehicle launches separately, also unmanned, also years early. It descends to the Martian surface under automated guidance and begins the propellant production process. The IISRU plant runs continuously, pulling carbon dioxide from the thin Martian atmosphere, combining it with hydrogen feedstock, producing liquid oxygen and methane through the Sabatier process and electrolysis. By the time the crew lands, the MAV is fully fueled. Its propellant tanks have been topped off and verified not once but repeatedly across the production cycle. The propellant has been tested for purity. The engine systems have been exercised through cold flow tests conducted remotely. The vehicle has been given every possible opportunity to reveal a problem before a human life depends on it. The crew, somewhere between 4 and 6 people in most current mission architectures, launches from Earth aboard a deep space transit vehicle. The specific launch system matters less than the habitat they will live in for the next 6 to 9 months. That habitat has been designed with everything we have discussed across these 9 parts in mind. The sleeping quarters are surrounded by a water wall, the crew's own water supply and recycled wastewater packed into panels lining the walls of the sleep stations, providing the best available passive shielding against galactic cosmic rays during the hours when the crew is least active and most vulnerable. The exercise system is the most advanced resistive training apparatus ever built for spaceflight, capable of applying loads that genuinely stress bone and muscle rather than simply simulating the motion of exercise without the biological stimulus that makes exercise useful. The lower body negative pressure device runs on a regular schedule for each crew member, drawing fluid downward, working to keep intracranial pressure within a range that protects the optic nerve and the brain. The medical suite aboard the transit vehicle is, within the mass budget, as comprehensive as current technology allows. It includes ultrasound capability, one of the most useful diagnostic tools in remote medicine because it requires no ionizing radiation and can image a wide range of internal structures. It includes a small surgical capability for life-threatening emergencies, with the understanding that microgravity surgery is extremely difficult and would only be attempted in the most serious circumstances. It carries a pharmaceutical formulary designed to address the most likely acute medical scenarios across the mission duration, with medications selected partly for their long shelf life stability under the radiation and temperature conditions of deep space. The crew includes at least one physician with surgical training, ideally 2 people with overlapping medical capabilities, so that no single point of failure leaves the crew without medical competence. 6 months into the outbound journey, something happens that every mission planner prepares for but hopes not to face: a solar energetic particle event. A coronal mass ejection from the Sun, releasing a wave of high-energy protons moving outward through the solar system at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The spacecraft's radiation monitoring system detects the incoming particle front. The crew has between 15 and 60 minutes of warning, depending on the intensity and direction of the event. The same systems that monitor solar weather from Earth also provide early warning to deep space missions, though the signal delay means the crew has to act on automated alerts rather than waiting for human guidance from the ground. The crew moves to the storm shelter, a smaller, more heavily shielded volume within the habitat, typically near the center of the spacecraft, surrounded on all sides by water walls, food storage, and equipment that provides additional passive shielding. They stay there for hours, potentially for a day or more, as the particle flux passes. The total dose they receive in the shelter is significantly lower than it would have been in the main habitat. It is not zero. It never is in deep space, but it is within the range that the mission's cumulative radiation budget can absorb. They emerge. They continue. Mars arrival is one of the most technically demanding moments in the entire mission. The transit vehicle performs a burn to slow into Mars orbit. The crew transfers for the descent to the Mars landing vehicle, a separate system designed for the brutal physics of entering and landing on a world with an atmosphere thin enough to be largely useless for aerobraking, but thick enough to cause heating during entry. Mars's atmosphere is about 1% as dense as Earth's, enough to create significant heat during entry at interplanetary approach velocities, but not enough to slow a spacecraft to landing speed without additional propulsion. The heat shield takes the thermal load. Retrorocket engines handle the final deceleration. The crew lands. The moment of touchdown on Mars is not triumphant silence. It is loud and violent and brief, and then suddenly, still the crew sits inside their lander on the surface of another planet. Outside, through a small viewport, the landscape of Mars extends in every direction. The sky is a pale, dusty pinkish tan during the day. Not the deep blue of Earth's atmosphere, but a color produced by fine iron oxide particles suspended in the thin air. The horizon is closer than it would be on Earth. Because Mars is a smaller world, its curvature brings the horizon in at a distance that initially feels slightly wrong to human spatial perception. The sun is visibly smaller than it appears from Earth. The light is dimmer. The shadows are different, and somewhere in that sky, just barely visible in the right conditions, is a bright blue-white star that does not twinkle the way the others do. Home. The surface stay in current mission architectures lasts somewhere between 300 and 500 days, depending on when the crew arrives relative to the optimal return launch window. This is not wasted time. It is the scientific heart of the mission. Geological surveys, drilling operations to access subsurface material, atmospheric studies, biological experiments designed to look for evidence of past or present microbial life in the most promising target environments, hydrothermal features, subsurface ice interfaces, ancient lakebed sediments. All of this conducted by people whose bodies are slowly, measurably adapting to Mars's 38% gravity. Partial adaptation, not full recovery to what Earth felt like, but a meaningful partial adjustment. The heart begins working harder again, at least at the level Mars demands. Some bone density loss stabilizes, though it does not fully reverse. The crew exercises. They eat as well as the food system allows. They sleep on a schedule calibrated to the Martian day. The Sol, which is 24 hours and 37 minutes long, slightly longer than an Earth day. Enough of a difference that their circadian rhythms require ongoing management, but close enough that the adjustment is achievable. Psychologically, the surface stay is both the most rewarding and the most isolating phase of the mission. The immediate goal orientation of landing has passed. The return window is months away. The crew is embedded in their work, in their habitat, in each other. The third quarter phenomenon is a real risk. The mission's behavioral health protocols, structured social activities, private communication time with family on Earth, despite the delay, psychological monitoring through regular assessments, clear mission milestones to work toward, are designed to carry the crew through this stretch. Some days are harder than others. That is not a failure. That is what it means to be human in an environment the human nervous system was not built for, and then the window opens. The geometry of the two planets has shifted into the alignment that makes a return trajectory efficient. The crew conducts final surface operations, secures the habitat for potential future use, because the infrastructure left behind has value for subsequent missions, and begins the Ascent preparation sequence. The MAV engine ignition is, in the words of one mission planner who described it in a publicly available NASA human spaceflight study, the single highest consequence moment in the entire mission. Everything that comes before it, the transit, the landing, the surface stay, can be extended, adjusted, modified. The Ascent cannot. It either works or it does not. The engines fire 4 kilometers per second of velocity change, built up over several minutes of powered ascent through the thin Martian atmosphere. The crew feels weight again, real weight, in the direction of the floor for the first time since they landed. Their cardiovascular systems, partially readapted to Martian gravity, are suddenly being asked to handle acceleration loads. Their weakened legs are pressed against their seats. Their vision, potentially slightly degraded from months of cerebrospinal pressure, processes the rapidly changing view through the viewport as Mars falls away below them. Mars orbit. The MAV has done its work. The rendezvous with the Earth return vehicle takes hours of careful maneuvering. The ERV's transponder guides the MAV to within range. Radar systems close the gap. The docking interface connects, seals are verified. The crew transfers, bringing with them the carefully contained Martian samples, double-sealed, triple-contained. Every protocol from the planetary protection playbook followed without exception. The MAV is released. The ERV fires its main engines for the trans-Earth injection burn. The return journey has begun, 6 to 9 months of transit, the same water walls, the same exercise regimen, the same LBNP sessions, the same medical monitoring, but with a different psychological texture than the outbound trip, because now the blue-white star in the viewport is growing. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, then, as the weeks become months and the distance closes, visibly, measurably, meaningfully brighter, Earth is getting bigger. The crew's bodies are carrying everything the journey has put into them. The cumulative radiation dose, the muscle and bone changes, the neurological adaptations, the cellular aging that even the best pharmaceutical protocols could only slow, not stop. They are not the same people who left. They cannot be. The universe does not allow that kind of return, but they are alive, and they are coming home. Atmospheric entry is violence and fire and noise, and then, suddenly, the extraordinary sensation of weight, real weight, 1 full G pressing down on bodies that have not fully felt it in years. The parachutes deploy over the Pacific, the capsule descends, and somewhere in the blue below, real blue, Earth blue, the blue of an atmosphere 4 billion years in the making, recovery vessels are moving to intercept splashdown. The capsule bobs on the surface of the ocean. Inside 6 people sit in silence for a moment, processing the sounds of water against the hull, the slight rocking motion, the smell of salt air beginning to leak in around the seals, and try to locate themselves in time and space and meaning. They are home, but not yet free. The quarantine protocols begin immediately. The samples are transferred under sealed containment. The crew is moved to the biocontainment facility, not as punishment, not as suspicion, but as the final expression of the same careful, honest, humble approach to the unknown that has characterized every good moment of human scientific endeavor. They wait, they are studied, they begin the long, slow process of rehabilitation, cardiovascular reconditioning, bone density recovery, vision monitoring, neurological assessment. The work of returning to Earth is its own kind of mission. And when the quarantine finally ends, when the science is satisfied that the 4 billion year chain of Earth biology remains intact, they step outside. For the first time in years, they stand under an open sky. They feel wind on their faces, they hear birds, they smell rain or grass, or the particular organic complexity of living soil that no engineered habitat has ever fully replicated. Above them, visible in the night sky on the right evening, is a small reddish point of light that neither rises nor sets in any particularly dramatic way. Just a star among stars, just a point of light. But they have been there. They have stood on that point of light and looked back at this one, and the universe, ancient, vast, indifferent to individual lives, but somehow improbably productive of minds capable of crossing it, is exactly the same size it was before they left, and yet somehow it feels different now, knowable in a way it did not before, not fully known, never fully known, but touched, reached, Acknowledged 13.8 billion years ago, there was nothing, not empty space, not darkness, not silence. Nothing in the most absolute, most literal sense of that word. No space, no time, no matter, no energy, no laws of physics waiting to be broken, no stage for anything to happen on, just the absence of everything, in a way that human language was never designed to describe, because human language evolved to describe a universe that already existed. And then, in an event whose precise mechanism remains one of the deepest open questions in all of science, existence began in the first fraction of the first second. The universe was smaller than an atom and hotter than anything that has existed since. It expanded, it cooled, particles formed, then hydrogen, then helium, then, across hundreds of millions of years, gravity gathered those clouds of hydrogen into the first stars, enormous, short-lived, burning hot and dying fast, seeding space with the heavier elements their cores had forged: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, calcium, the raw material of us. Those elements scattered across the galaxy in stellar explosions of almost incomprehensible violence. They drifted through molecular clouds. They were gathered again by gravity into new solar systems, including roughly 4.6 billion years ago, ours. The sun ignited. The planets formed from the leftover disk of gas and dust, including a small, rocky, water-rich world at just the right distance from its star to maintain liquid oceans. And on that world, in those oceans, approximately 4 billion years ago, something happened that has not, to our current knowledge, happened anywhere else in the observable universe. Chemistry became biology. From that first self-replicating molecule to the human beings planning a mission to Mars is 4 billion years of unbroken continuity. Every organism in that chain survived long enough to reproduce. Every extinction event that wiped out the majority of species on Earth nevertheless left enough survivors to continue the thread. The asteroid that killed the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago was, from a different angle, the event that cleared ecological space for small mammals to diversify, eventually producing primates, eventually producing hominins, eventually producing a species that looked up at the night sky and began to wonder, we are the universe's longest-running experiment in self-awareness. And the Mars return mission, with all of its biological complexity, its engineering audacity, its psychological depth, its planetary protection protocols, its orbital mechanics and radiation biology and cellular senescence, is that experiment reaching a new threshold. For the first time in 4 billion years, life that originated on Earth is seriously, concretely, technically planning to visit another planet and come back, not send a probe, not crash a lander, not roll a rover across the surface and beam back photographs. Send people, human people, with their calcium bones and their shrinking hearts and their cerebrospinal fluid and their prefrontal cortexes and their capacity for awe, to stand on another world, do science there, and then climb back into a rocket and return to the world that made them. That is what we have been talking about across these 10 parts. And now that we have laid out every dimension of why it is so difficult, I want to spend this final part sitting with why it matters so deeply that we try. There is a concept in philosophy of science called the anthropic principle. In its most basic form, it observes that the universe we find ourselves in must be compatible with the existence of observers, because if it were not, there would be no observers to find themselves in it. It is a tautology in a sense, but it points at something genuinely strange and worth considering. The universe did not have to produce observers. It did not have to produce complexity. The laws of physics could have been slightly different, the strength of gravity a little higher, the ratio of matter to antimatter a little more balanced at the beginning, the nuclear forces a little weaker, and stars would never have formed or would have burned out before they could seed galaxies with heavy elements or matter would have annihilated itself in the first moments after the Big Bang, leaving only radiation expanding forever through an empty universe. Instead, we got this. We got a universe fine-tuned, whether by design, by necessity, or by the statistical logic of a vast multiverse, for the emergence of complexity, of chemistry, of biology, of minds. And those minds have now looked out at the universe that produced them, understood, at least partially, how it works, and decided to use that understanding to reach across the void toward one of their neighboring worlds. That is either the most natural thing in the universe or the most remarkable. Possibly both simultaneously. What does it mean specifically for the question of returning from Mars? It means that every challenge we have described, every biological obstacle, every engineering problem, every psychological pressure, is not evidence that we should not go. It is evidence of the gap between what we currently are and what we are trying to become, between the species that evolved for one specific planet and the species that wants to be more than that. The gap is real. The challenges are real. We have not minimized them here, and we should not minimize them anywhere. The people who will one day make this journey deserve the full honesty of what the science says about what it will cost them, but gaps have been crossed before. Not by pretending they do not exist, by understanding them precisely enough to build a bridge. The bridge to Mars return is being built right now. In the radiation biology laboratories at Brookhaven National Laboratory, where particle accelerators simulate galactic cosmic rays so that researchers can study their effects on neural tissue. In the Human Research Program at NASA's Johnson Space Center, where flight surgeons and physiologists are designing the countermeasure protocols that will carry a crew through 2 years of deep space exposure. In the materials science departments developing new shielding composites. In the senescence biology labs, where the first human clinical trials of senolytic compounds are generating data that could one day reshape what the human body can endure in deep space. In the aerospace engineering teams designing a Mars Ascent vehicle that has to work perfectly the first time alone on another planet. In the propulsion laboratories working on systems that could shorten the transit time, because every day less in deep space is a day less of radiation exposure, a day less of bone loss, a day less of psychological pressure. Nuclear thermal propulsion, which could potentially reduce Mars transit time to as little as 3 to 4 months, is being actively researched by NASA and by DARPA under a program called Draco, the demonstration rocket for agile cislunar operations. If nuclear thermal propulsion reaches operational readiness for a Mars mission, it changes the biological calculus of the entire journey meaningfully, and in the quiet, careful work of planetary protection scientists who are designing the biocontainment protocols that will ensure a returning crew can come home without threatening the biosphere that produced them. Let us talk about something that does not show up in any technical document, but that matters as much as all of it. What will we know after the first successful Mars return mission that we do not know now? We will know whether the human body, with every countermeasure we can devise, can survive the round trip to Mars and recover meaningfully. That knowledge will be the foundation of every subsequent Mars mission ever conducted. The first crew's medical data will be the most valuable dataset in the history of human spaceflight. We will know whether the overview effect scales the way researchers suspect it might, whether seeing Earth as a distant star from the surface of another world produces something in the returning crew members that is qualitatively different from what any previous astronaut has experienced. The psychological and philosophical testimony of the first people to return from Mars will be studied and referenced for generations. We will know, from the Martian samples brought back under planetary protection protocols, whether Mars harbors or has harbored life. That answer whatever it is, will be the most consequential scientific finding in human history. If the answer is no, if Mars is, and has always been, biologically sterile, that tells us something profound about how rare the chemistry to biology transition is, and makes the 4 billion-year thread of Earth life feel even more extraordinary and more precious. If the answer is yes, if there is or was life on Mars, then we are not alone in the solar system. Life is not an accident confined to one fortunate planet. It is something the universe does when conditions allow. Either answer reshapes our understanding of everything, and here is where I want to leave you, not with a conclusion, because this story does not have one yet, but with a perspective. You are alive at the moment in history when this question is being seriously, technically, concretely addressed for the first time, not dreamed about, not written about in science fiction, though the fiction has been extraordinary and important, actually engineered, actually funded, actually argued over in peer-reviewed journals and mission planning meetings and congressional hearings. The people who will one day stand on Mars and fire the engines of the Mars Ascent vehicle and rise through that pink-tan sky and rendezvous with the Earth return vehicle in Mars orbit and begin the long journey home. Some of them are alive right now. Some of them are children right now, looking up at the night sky with the same curiosity that has driven every great act of human exploration in the history of our species. The atoms in their bodies, the calcium in their bones that microgravity will try to dissolve, the iron in their blood that ancient stars forged, have been traveling through the universe for billions of years, passing through stellar cores and interstellar clouds and planetary formation events, before assembling themselves, against all probability, into a person who will one day cross the void between worlds. We are made of stardust. We are also made of curiosity, of the stubborn, unreasonable, magnificent refusal to accept the current edge of human experience as the final one, of the capacity to look at a problem of almost incomprehensible difficulty, biological, neurological, psychological, engineering, planetary protection, orbital mechanical, and say, we will understand this, we will solve this, we will do this, not because it is easy, because it is hard in exactly the way that makes us more than we were before we tried. Why can't you return from Mars? Because the human body was built for Earth, because the radiation of dead stars flows through the void between worlds, because the geometry of orbits is merciless in its timing, because the machinery of departure from another planet has never been tested by a human hand, because the biology of return is more complex than the engineering of departure, because the universe itself imposes constraints that 4 billion years of evolution did not prepare us, for those are all true, every one of them, and none of them is final. The most honest answer to the question this video has been asking is not that you cannot return from Mars, it is that you cannot return from Mars yet, not safely, not with the certainty that the people making the journey deserve, not without solving problems that brilliant people are working on right now with urgency and with rigor and with the full weight of human scientific capability behind them, yet is the most important word in the history of exploration, yet implies a future, a direction, a gap that can be crossed if enough intelligence and will and honesty is brought to bear on it. And the universe, indifferent as it is to our individual lives and our individual timelines, has improbably produced a species with exactly those qualities in abundance. We are the cosmos looking at itself and asking, how far can we go? The answer is still being written. Look up tonight. Find that small, reddish point of light in the sky if it is visible from where you are. It rises in the east and moves slowly westward through the night, the way planets do, steadier than the stars around it, without the twinkling that atmospheric turbulence produces in starlight. Just a quiet, persistent point of reddish light. Someone will stand there one day. and they will look back at where you are standing right now, at this pale, luminous, extraordinarily improbable world, and they will understand, in a way that no photograph and no video and no description can fully convey, what it means to be alive in this universe, and they will find a way home. And if this video left you wondering just how brutal deep space really is, click the video on your screen right now. We explore why you wouldn't survive 100 days on Mars. And trust me, after everything we just covered, you are not ready for what's in it.